Before the sun cleared the cottonwoods along Cedar Creek, a man stood at the gate of the farm the whole town called cursed, and he did the one thing no soul in Cedar Ford would lower himself to do. He asked the goat widow for help. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough, scraped thin from a night with no sleep in it, "I know what they call this place. I know what they call you." He shifted the small bundle in the crook of one arm, and it made a sound that was hardly a cry, only a dry catching of breath. "My wife is 3 days buried. This is my son. He was born the morning she died, and he has not kept down a swallow of milk since, not from one cow in this valley." "Whose milk have you tried?" she asked. "Every clean cow between here and the county line. The Ostrander herd. The Trice herd. My own 2 Jerseys. He takes it, and he brings it straight back up, and he is smaller today than the morning we buried his mother." He raised his eyes to her over the rail. "They tell me your milk is poison. They tell me this ground killed a man. But my boy is starving on the milk everybody swears is clean, and I have run clean out of clean." His jaw worked. "Can you feed a motherless child?" She did not answer with words. She stepped down off her stone, reached across, lifted the latch, and swung the gate open between them. "Bring him in out of the wind," she said, "and mind the second doe." She butts. Her name was Nell Ashby, and she was 30 years old that spring of 1885. 2 summers back her husband and the best of his cattle had sickened and died on this wooded creek quarter of a thing the country called the Trimples, and Cedar Ford, not understanding what had killed them, had named the ground cursed and the widow along with it, so that decent people crossed to the far side of the road rather than pass her gate or buy the poisoned milk of the goats she had. Turned to when the cattle were gone. She was lean and straight-backed, with raven hair worked into a braided crown that never quite held. A strand or 2 always slipped loose against a weather-touched cheek, and dark eyes that met a person level and did not drop. Inside her low, clean cabin she took the child without asking, unwound the flannel from the small blue face, and studied it a long moment. "He is not dying today," she said. "The doctor said, 'The doctor is wrong. He is hungry is all. That is a different thing, and it is a thing I can mend.'" She had a doe milked, and the milk warmed and strained through muslin before Dan Mercer had his hat off, and she dribbled it off one clean finger onto the baby's tongue, patient as rain. "There now," she murmured, not to the man. "Slow, nobody is taking it from you." The swallowing started. Dan stood in the middle of her floor and watched his son eat and did not trust himself to speak. "How is it he keeps yours down?" he asked at last. "Goat's milk is easier on a new stomach than a cow's, always has been. City doctors forget it. Farm women never did." She watched the baby a moment. "He will take a pail morning and night. You will fetch it warm and feed him slow, and inside a month you will not know him. Then I will pay you, whatever is fair. And your mare, I have seen her standing out in the weather with no shed to her name. Board her in my barn through the winter, that much I can do. I will not take your money. Ma'am, I will not take it." She said it plainly, as though telling him the sky was up. "A child's supper is not a thing I sell. You will have your milk, morning and night, for as long as the boy needs it, and it will cost you nothing. That is not right. A woman alone knows better than most what a thing is worth, Miss Mercer, and this one is not for sale." Then, because the mare was old and the creek winters cruel, she allowed him the one thing. "The stabling I will take. My mare has earned a dry stall. That is the whole of the trade, and we will not speak of money again. Dan Mercer left the cursed farm that morning with a covered tin pail warm against his ribs and a bargain the town would chew over harder than any scandal in 10 years. Junie Trice had it first, because Junie Trice had everything first. A grown man, she told the women at the mercantile, loud enough to carry, boarding that creature's horse in his own barn, and feeding his motherless baby off cursed milk, off the very ground that killed her husband. If his poor dead wife could see it. They say the child is failing anyhow, offered one of the Ostrander girls. Well, of course he is failing. What did they expect? Off poison? Nobody at the counter said aloud what a few of them had already noticed, that the Mercer boy had been failing on their clean milk and was not failing now. If you have ever watched a whole town decide that a steady, capable person had gone soft in the head, and been too proud or too frightened to walk up and ask her one plain question, then you already understand why this channel exists. Stay with Nell Ashby. This is a story about the question the valley refused to ask her, and it is going to turn. He came back that evening for the second pail, and the next dawn for the third. And before the first week was out, he had done the very thing Cedar Ford would not. He asked her. "I have to ask you something," he said, "and you can send me off for it if you like." He nodded toward the goats. "If the Trimbles killed your husband on this ground, if it killed his cattle right here, how is it your milk is the one milk in the valley that is safe? How can you know that?" Nell was quiet a moment. Then she went inside and came back with a book, water-stained, its oilcloth cover gone soft to skin, and she opened it on the top rail between them. "This was my grandmother's," she said, "and her grandmother's before her. There is a rule in it an old herb woman set down up in the Illinois bottoms, and she had it, so the family tells it. From a Shawnee healer who knew the creek shade better than any man with a diploma." She turned a page and read it out, her finger under the cramped old hand. "The white-flowered weed of the shaded bottoms is death in a dry year. Let no milk cow graze the low woods when the grass is burned, for the poison passes through her milk to whoever drinks, and neither the cow nor the child is spared." "Snake root," Dan said slowly. "White snake root. It grows in the wet shade along every creek in this country, and it is harmless 9 years in 10, because the cattle have grass and never bother it. But let a drought burn off the good pasture, and the cows go hunting the green low places, and they eat it, and it comes through in the milk." She closed the book. "That is what killed my Tom. That is what killed his cattle. It was never this ground. It was that weed in the dry summer of the year he died. And the town called it a curse. The town buried him under a curse because a curse asks no questions," Nell said. "A weed asks a great many. So I spent 2 years asking them." And she told him then, in the flat voice of a woman reciting a thing she has earned, how she had walked her own bottoms with the book in her apron and found the weed standing shoulder high in the exact shade the cattle had gone down to for the cool, how she had taken a grubbing hoe and a hand fork and cleared it, stalk by stalk, root by root, day upon day for 2 years, off the bank and out of the draws and along every wet run of her quarter, and how, where the brush grew back, she had not fought it, but fenced her goats onto it. "A goat does not graze like a cow," she said. "It browses. It eats the brush down head high and leaves the low weed be, and it will not touch snake root at all so long as there is another green thing to be had. My ground is the cleanest ground in this county now, Miss Mercer. It wears the name cursed only because no one ever asked me what I had done to it. Dan looked at the goats a long while. Why do you not tell them? Because they did not ask, she said. You did. So the autumn turned, and a routine grew up between the two farms that nobody in town could see and everybody in town discussed. Every morning before light, Nell walked the 1.5 miles to the Mercer place with the covered pail, and every evening she walked it again, and the baby everyone had written off began, ounce by careful ounce, to hold his milk and hold his weight and turn from blue to pink. She weighed him on her egg scale wrapped in a shawl and set the ounces down in the back of the herb book beside her grandmother's recipes, because that was where she kept the things that mattered. And a courtship went on inside that plain arrangement without a word to name it. And the narrator will not name it for them either. Dan saw her gate hung crooked and dragging, so one afternoon while she milked, he lifted it off its leather straps and rehung it on iron he had forged himself, and afterward it swung silent and true, and she said nothing, only ran a hand along the top rail as she passed. She saw the baby's ears go red in the cold on the dawn walk, so she knit a small wool bonnet by lamplight and left it folded in the bottom of the milk basket, and Dan found it and said nothing, only tied it under the boy's chin. He watched how she strained the milk twice and scalded the pail with water off the boil. And afterward he scalded his own before she came. One gray morning he stopped her at the gate. "Stay for coffee. It is poured. Talk will start." Talk started in October. He held the gate, let it. Stay. She stayed. But the talk did not stay, only talk. Hetty Sparrow, the preacher's wife, drew herself up to her full height in the churchyard one Sunday and made it doctrine. No decent family in this congregation, she said, will touch a drop of that woman's milk, and any that does may answer to me before they answer to heaven. The men looked at their boots. Not one of them said aloud that the Mercer boy was fatter and louder every single week. Then came the worst of it. On a raw November evening, 6 of the church women came to Dan Mercer's door in a body. Hetty at the front with her Bible held against her chest like a shield. "We come out of Christian love, Miss Mercer," Hetty said. "You owe it to your dead wife to send that child to your married sister in Topeka and raise him decent, on clean cow's milk, far from that farm and that woman. It is not natural. It is not clean. That poor lamb belongs with his own family." Dan stood in his own doorway with his son on one arm and his face gone white and hard, and he was a long time answering. "Mrs. Sparrow," he said at last, very low, "the clean cow's milk in this valley is what near put my boy in the ground beside his mother. Nell Ashby's milk is what pulled him back. You have buried 4 little ones this year off wholesome milk, the Ostrander cousins, the Rue infant, the Trice girl in the fall. I have not buried one off hers." He looked down the row of them. "You call her ground cursed. I have stood at your clean gravesides, and I have not stood at one of hers. Now go home, ladies," and he closed the door, gently, in 6 good women's faces, that same week in the black hours after midnight. Someone slipped down to the creek quarter and lifted the rails out of Nell's back fence, and by first light her whole herd was scattered up and down the wooded bottoms, the one place on earth she never let them go. She spent a day and a night in the cold and the brush, chasing them home 2 and 3 at a time, her skirts torn, her hands cut, calling them low through the dark. She got them all back but one, a young doe found hock deep in the shaded run at the far corner where a single stand of snakeroot had crept back in when her attention was elsewhere, cropping it, her muzzle green. Nell stood over the dough a long moment. "You could not have known," she said quietly. "That is the trouble with it. Neither could a child." And she did the hardest, coldest thing a poor woman can do. She would not risk one pail of that dough's milk reaching the Mercer boy or any other child, and she did not yet know how deep the weed was in her, so she put the dough down that evening with her husband's rifle and buried her deep away from the water, and lost the price of her and the milk of her and the 2 kids she would have thrown come spring. It was the nearest Nell Ashby came, in the whole of it, to selling out and driving her wagon east and leaving Cedar Ford to its poison and its prayers. She sat up that night with the herb book open on her knee, and she did not quit. She wrote the loss down instead. The date, the dough, the corner of the fence, the weed that had crept back in a hand that shook only a little, and what the whole town was about to learn, the thing that would empty its own sick rooms, lay pressed flat between 2 pages of a dead woman's book, and not one of them had ever once asked to see it. Anyone who has kept a hard truth alive while the whole world told them to bury it, anyone who has been right and alone for years will understand what the next summer asked of her. Stay with this one to the end and subscribe so the next of these stories finds you. Because what the drought did to Cedar Ford the following summer is the reason this one is still told. The drought came the next summer, slow and then all at once. The uplands burned brown by July, the good pasture curled to nothing, the high creeks went to cracked mud, and up and down the valley the cattlemen, out of grass and out of choices, drove their thirsty herds down off the burned benches into the one green place left in all that country, the shaded, wet, wooded creek bottoms, where the snake root grew. And the Trimbles came back to Cedar Ford, not to the cursed farm on the clean grubbed quarter where the goats browsed their fenced brush and never went near the weed. This time it came for the town. It came for the milk-fed children first, as it always comes, for the smallest and the thirstiest. The little Ostrander boy down with the staggers and the puking sickness, then 2 of the Trice grandchildren, then the Pole twins, then more. 9 children in 10 days, weak and vomiting, their small legs gone unsteady beneath them, while the milk cows in half the valley's barns staggered in their stalls and dried up. Then Dr. Pryor's own wife took to her bed with it. The doctor was a good and careful man, and he stood in one sick room after another with his bag open and his hands empty. "It is a summer flux," he told the mothers. "Keep them cool, boil the drinking water." But the water was not the cause, and the flux had no name in any book he owned, and the children did not mend. "I do not know what this is," he admitted at last, grave-faced. "To Dan Mercer on the street, I have never seen its like. It is taking them off good, clean milk, and I cannot tell you why. I know a woman who can," Dan said. Nell Ashby walked into town in the middle of the day, the herb book under her arm and a single tall stalk of white-flowered weed in her fist, pulled that morning from the Mercer bottoms where the neighbors had turned their cattle in. She went past the crossing where they crossed away from her, up the steps of the house where the doctor's wife lay, and into the sick room the town had barred her from her whole life. Dr. Pryor turned, startled and angry. "You cannot be in here. You have been hunting a fever," Nell said, and she laid the book open on the coverlet and set the pulled stalk on the white sheet beside it. "Roots and dirt and all. It is not a fever, it is this. That is a weed, that is white snake root, and it is killing your patients. It grows in the shade down in the creek bottoms, harmless, until a drought burns off the grass and the cattle are driven down to eat it. Then it passes straight through the cow into her milk, and out of the milk into every child who drinks a drop. She set her finger on the stalk. That is your summer flux. Doctor, that is the thing with no name in your books. It killed my husband 2 summers back on my own quarter, and the town called my ground cursed for it. If that were so, it would be in the literature. I have never once read you have never farmed a creek bottom through a drought. An old woman in Illinois had it written down before you were born. She turned the page and showed him the rule, and then the 2 years of her own notes running after it, the dates, the deaths, the dough put down at the far fence corner. Take every cow off the bottoms this hour, she said, and take every sick child off cow's milk. That is the whole of the cure. Pryor was a man of sense, and looking from the weed to the book to the widow's study face, sense won. He turned to the men crowded at the door. You heard her. Every cow up out of the creek woods. Now, today, all of them. Then he turned back to the woman he would have crossed the road to avoid a week before. The children, he said. What do I give the children if their milk is poison? Mine, my goats, are clean. I cleared my ground 2 years past, and they have never touched the weed. She was already rolling her sleeves. The cursed milk is the only clean milk left for 20 miles. Get me pails, doctor, and get me wagons. So began the strangest fortnight Cedar Fort had ever seen, and it ran on 2 counts the whole town watched rise and fall against each other. On the one hand, the sick count. 9 children down that first day, some so low their mothers had stopped weeping and gone quiet, which is worse. On the other, the pail count. Nell could not feed 9 sick children and a valley of frightened babies off one small herd, so she milked every drop she had and drove the deliveries herself, dawn and noon and dusk, and Dan harnessed his team to run pails to the far houses. And the men who had laughed at his boarding her mare now loaded her tin pails into their own wagons without a word. Slow, she told each frightened mother kneeling by each small bed. Off a spoon, not a bottle. A little, and then a little more. His stomach has forgotten how to trust it. Teach it gentle. And the sick count began to fall. 9 children, and then within the week 7, the little Ostrander boy sitting up and asking for bread. Then 4. Then, the morning Dr. Pryor stood on his own porch and told the gathered street, there is not a child in Cedar Fort in danger any longer. And it is not my doing. You have a widow and a herd of goats to thank, off the same milk this town swore was poison. And down in the bottoms, all that fortnight, the men worked the thing at its root. Nell led them into the shade with her grandmother's book and taught them to know the weed from the harmless green around it. And the neighbors who had scorned that book now followed her through the wet dark, pulling snake root by the wagon load, stalk and root, hauling it to burn on the high dry ground where nothing would drink from it. Grubbing the valley clean, quarter by quarter, the very labor the town had called madness, when one lone woman did it on her own ground. She did not gloat. There is no scene in this story where Nell Ashby stands in the churchyard and tells Hetty Sparrow what to do with her doctrine. She gave the milk free to every stricken family as she had given it free to the Mercer boy. And when the Pole family lost both their cows to the Staggers, she promised them 2 doe kids off her herd come spring, so they would never again stand at the mercy of another man's poisoned pail. And the town came to her fence one at a time. as such towns always do. The humblest came first, and it was the last one anybody expected. Hetty Sparrow, who had made it doctrine that no decent soul would touch that milk, came down the road to the creek quarter on foot one gray morning with an empty pail and stood at the gate that swung silent now on Dan Mercer's iron, and had no speech left in her at all. She had a granddaughter of 6 coming through the sickness on Nell's milk. She held the empty pail out in both hands, and her chin trembled, and she said only, "Please." Nell looked at her a long while, then took the pail, filled it, and gave it back. Neither woman ever spoke of it again. Then the doctor put it past all argument. Pryor wrote a letter, and not to the town, but to the state medical board and the agricultural college, naming the milk sickness, and the white snake root that caused it, and the drought that drove the cattle to it, and naming the woman who had known the whole of it for 2 years, while a valley of educated men called it a visitation. And the county, which had once set down in its own record that Tom Ashby died of a visitation upon cursed ground, opened its book, struck the line, and wrote the true one, that he had died of the milk sickness of white snake root in a dry season, and that his ground was not cursed and never had been. And one Sunday the preacher himself, Hetty Sparrow's own husband, stood up in the church that had shunned her, opened the water-stained herb book, and read the old rule aloud to the whole congregation. The white-flowered weed of the shaded bottoms is death in a dry year, he read. Let no milk cow graze the low woods when the grass is burned. A dead herb woman's rule, true and freely given all along, read out in the very building where the shunning had begun. Nell Ashby sat in the back and heard her grandmother read aloud in a church, and her face, a neighbor said after, was not the face of a woman who had been wronged. It was the face of a woman who had finally been seen. Dan Mercer came to her gate one more time at dawn, as he had the first, but not with a dying bundle and a desperate voice and a question about milk. He came with a strong, brown, fat-legged boy near a year old, riding high on one arm, grabbing at his father's hat, a boy given up for dead on the milk everyone called clean, and pulled back to life on the milk everyone called poison. Dan stood at the silent gate he had hung himself. Nell came down to meet him with a warm pail in her hand, out of long habit, and for a moment neither said a word, because they had already said most of it in a rehung gate and a knit bonnet and a scalded pail across a whole long year. I did not come for milk, Dan said. I know it. I have been coming to this gate near a year, and every time I have had a reason in my hand, a pail, a question, a sick boy. He looked at her steady. I have run clean out of reasons, Nell. I only wanted the woman. The boy reached for her, and Dan let him go into her arms across the rail, and then Dan Mercer said the 4 plain words he had walked 1.5 miles in the dark to say, "Come home with us." And she did. There is a coda to this, and it is the part that matters most, because these stories are never truly about the winning. Year on year after that, the wooded bottoms all along Cedar Creek were grubbed clean of the weed, quarter by quarter, by the sons of the men who had once called it madness, until the milk sickness that had emptied cradles in that country for 2 generations simply stopped, and the young mothers who came after never learned to fear a shaded creek in a dry summer, which is the finest thing hard knowledge can ever do, to make itself forgotten. A herd of white and brown goats browsed the cleared brush on the ground nobody called cursed anymore. And the water-stained herb book, the one the town would not touch, lived out its days on the mantel of the Mercer house, kept dry and kept red, with a new line written fresh in the flyleaf in Nell's own careful hand, beneath her grandmother's name and her grandmother's grandmother's before that. It was a boy's name, Samuel Mercer, fed at dawn on a cursed farm and grown. If you have ever brought back a thing your whole town swore was worthless, a method, a ground, a manner of doing that everyone with sense had left behind, and lived long enough to watch those same people come to your fence with an empty pail, then this story was for you. And I would be glad to know where you are listening from tonight. Leave your town in the comments and answer me this before you go. If it had been your own child burning up that dry and terrible summer, and the only clean pail for 20 miles was the one the whole town swore was poison, would you have handed him to the doctor with his books and his boiled water, or to a shunned widow with a dead woman's ledger and a herd of goats that nobody wanted?